So good morning. Day 2 of the Property Investor Show. Welcome. Thank you for being here in Theatre 5. I'm delighted to be joined by this gentleman here, Nathan Emerson, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Property Mark. Nathan, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
So this should be, really interesting. Obviously, Property Mark are the industry's biggest, most preferred, best known regulator and oversight body. Perhaps we can talk about that first, Nathan, in terms of, I guess, what Property Mark is for the one or two people in the world that don't know what it is and what you do.
Absolutely. So we are effectively the professional organisation for the majority of the property sector. So we cover residential sales through the National Association of Estate Agents. We cover lettings through ALA. We have auctions through NAVA. And we have Property Mark Commercial as well. So we cover most of the main areas of the property sector. And all of those are agents that subscribe to that to be regulated. And they carry the Property Mark protected logo.
And it's voluntary.
It is voluntary. And I think that's actually quite an important badge of honour for many of them, really. They do subscribe to that process, really.
Oversight.
And oversight, and actually that actually shows quite clearly that they are the agents that do want to be benchmarked, they do want to succeed, and they do want to set the standard, where I think the entire property sector wants to be, really. You know, people do want to be seen above the rest.
We'll come on to the question of licensing, because obviously you guys are kind of leading the way in terms of pushing for that. I happen to be a fan of licensing. Not every estate or letting agent is, but we'll come on to that. You're quite new in your role. I think you're, where are we? 6 months in, 7 months in?
7 months in,
As
you're
technically
right. Absolutely.
Interim CEO. Can we talk a little bit about, I guess, first of all, the progress you've made, albeit it's only been 6 months. It's been a very short period of time in the scheme of things. But would it be right to say you've come in to kind of right the ship slightly? Because obviously there have been some troubled waters in previous months. I don't know how much you want to elaborate on that. And I know this is very much about Property Mark going forward. But anything to say in terms of troubles of the past and what you've done in your short tenure so far to kind of put things right?
Yeah, I think part of where I am really is pulling all of the divisions together in a much tighter knit. And you have to bear in mind that Property Mark itself came together because there were numerous professional organisations which were in the sector, which individually their voice was not as loud as the combined. So by combining all of those voices together, what it does do is give you a much stronger platform in order to talk, to resonate, to engage, and to drive policy, really. So the whole point of all those organisations together under the Property Mark banner was to be more representative of the property sector as a whole and the professionals that sit within it. So with any relationship coming together, I think it's natural to say that people obviously have their own idiosyncrasies, and different divisions have their way.
And culture differences.
Culture differences, everything. And one thing I would say, I think where my job has been to pull those together. Very fortunately, myself as a long-standing practitioner, I've worked in all of those sectors, really, commercial, auctioneering, residential sales and lettings, and that does give me probably the ability to speak across disciplines, really, and move people together. And as we've started that process, what we've now found is all of those areas are looking to grow. They're all working together much more seamlessly, really. And again, we've invested quite heavily now in Property Mark, so we've expanded our policy team quite dramatically, and we're at a stage now where not only do we cover the devolved nations, but we actually have the strength of personnel that allows us to actually go out and engage politically, rather than probably a little bit before, where we were effectively just reporting effectively what was happening, really.
You've come in as a person with no kind of previous Property Mark NAA ALA baggage, I suppose, which presumably has helped in terms of sewing the cultures together.
Absolutely. I mean, I was sat on the main board, so I had an oversight of what was going on, but that's very different from being fully operational in the front end. And I'm not somebody that sits on my laurels, really, and we knew where we needed to get to, and my job really has been to start putting their foundation stones in there for the organisation to sit permanently in a solid foundation and start to build out and progress, really.
And you're making progress in that respect,
Very.
albeit only 6 months in?
It's going very well, yeah.
You're happy with it?
I'm very happy. We've been able to start a lot of very large projects which are underway at the moment, which will come to light in the next 12 months.
Can you give us a sneak peek today?
No. Nice try. But we do have some fantastic opportunities coming through for professionals in the sector and obviously the clients and the benefit from there. In addition to that, I think the credibility of the organisation, is holding together exceptionally well. We're getting a lot of supporters, and we're getting a lot of people that were previous members wanting to come back into the fold, really, and get involved. And that is, for me, very, very exciting because there is a place for everybody. We all want to see standards raising. We all want to see that when somebody, the consumer, gives their property to a professional agent, they are going to look after them and they are going to do the very best service. And for those that are in the professions and the industry that see bad practice, it is actually a fairly sickening. I mean, obviously, from your side of things, when you see bad practice going on out there and you see consumers, landlords, vendors not receiving the level of support they should do, the treatment they should do, or necessarily, even getting the advice that they should do, that actually frustrates a lot of us. And so actually, by raising those standards and continuing to talk and to continue to start educating, the clients and the consumers as to what they should be receiving out there, I think is very important. But also, more importantly, for people to have the redress. When things do go wrong, we need to understand why, and how do we then take those lessons learned and how do we expand everything to let everybody improve.
And I guess the question from what you just said, I suppose that I have to ask is that do Property Mart think that they have to be and will be more communicative, both with the consumer generally and the industry, to help raise that trust and credibility? So to do a better job of communications, because I personally think that the organisation's communications until you started was pretty dire, really.
I'd like to think, obviously, I've been able to put some complete transparency there, and I am a very open book, and I think the organisation wants to do that as well. So we have looked at communication quite strongly. I've doubled the size of the marketing team. We have dedicated social media people literally joining in the next week or so, which will start that campaign, which will work very much to the consumer. We did TV adverts in the past, and obviously they only have a limited effect, but we want a dedicated resource that can not only communicate with the professionals in the industry and what they need to do when they need to do it, but also to make sure that there is a consumer understanding as the difference between a Property Mart regulated agent and ones that are unregulated, really. And so that communication piece is out there. We've got a PR team, as you know now.
Very important.
Is very important.
Super important.
Absolutely, and also we have the backing of one of the biggest PR agencies out there as well. So, we're from a communication point of view, we've set that stall out very well now.
So you've made some changes?
Yes.
Yeah, good. And I think in a positive way. I think that every agent, whether they're a member of your organisation or not, would agree that change is necessary, and that the communication flow and hopefully the positivity that will come from it will kind of steer you in a positive direction going forward. And I guess one of the other questions though is that the organisation's well established, has credibility. It's voluntary, of course, and as a consequence, only 25% of UK estate and letting agents are a member of the body or bodies. I guess the question is why, perhaps, and also what you and the organisation can do about that to increase membership. Because, again, it all speaks to credibility from the consumer's perspective.
It does. And if I can answer that in three ways. I think for a sector to actually have 25, 27% of practitioners actually involved on a voluntary basis actually is very good. And so actually the starting base is, for me, superb, because it does show there is a professional will out there, and we do respect the profession we're in. The engagement cycle ongoing is now the next important side. How do we build on that? And it's not just necessarily about members, because you could open the door tomorrow and say everybody can be a member for whatever reason. It's actually about making sure that the benchmark is effective. So we don't want it to be you just fill your name in, pay some money, and you're a member.
You don't want it to be quantitative only.
Correct. We want the standards, and we want people that sign up to those standards, and that is, that does work, and we are seeing membership hold very, very well, especially bearing in mind the the pandemic. We've seen that not only hold, but we have seen that continue to increase. And a lot of student members as well wanting to come forward to start education, which,
Really?
you know, we talk about ROPA, and I'm sure you might come on to that, and the types of qualifications that people will need in order to practice, you know, once that gets implemented. But actually, there is a desire out there from people entering the professions to actually start that journey. And we've seen 24% increase in level 3 and level 4 outtake, which, you know, is well above the targets that we'd initially set. And so there's definitely an appetite out there, I think, to raise those standards.
Yeah, and you guys are leading the way in terms of licensing, which I guess is a follow-on from what we've just talked about. Licensing, I think, is well overdue. It's astonishing, actually, that we exist in an industry that deals with people's most valuable asset and, you know, looks after what they achieve for that as part of a sale or a rental transaction. Yet estate agents are not licensed. I mean, they're licensed in just about every other country. In this country, financial services, takeaways, cabs, everything else is licensed, but not estate and letting agents. I know you and your organisation have strong views on that, and you're leading the way in terms of ROPA. Just explain a bit about, I guess, your stance and progress that perhaps has been made towards licensing.
Yeah, so we were, along with other organisations, obviously, that represent the property sector, we were involved in the initial reviews of what could be done and how it could be done, which was a panel chaired by Lord Best. That completed its review and obviously submitted, and obviously things are working their way through the system. I think what came out of that when that review was done, that by and large, you know, you're quite right, you are dealing with people's biggest assets, and you know, and it's like everything, you do have the odd rotten apple in the barrel, spoils the bunch, and I think everybody wants to be in a position where we are able to be held accountable for what we do, but also that we can demonstrate that we've achieved that level, really. You know, there are people here in the audience today that are investing, and they will talk to people, they will ask for advice. It's nice to know and have the reassurance that that person is effectively qualified to do that job and has at least attained a certain benchmark and practices within a certain environment. You know, if we all went to a doctor with no qualifications and he wanted to cut your finger off, you might think twice whether you're going to let him. So, you know, we want to see that you know, that comes through.
But you want to be the body.
I think we want to be heavily involved. Whether we are ultimately the body, I think that will depend on how government feels at that time. Whether we are or not the body shouldn't be the thing that prevents us wanting to see everything at that standard. And, you know, I mean, if you look at the FCA when financial services came in, that was a massive overhaul for everybody to race to get themselves compliant, get themselves qualified. You know, but by and large, you know, they got there, and I think most of us would say that from a mortgage point of view, when you go and sign a mortgage up now, you feel a bit more confident that the banks, building societies and the individuals in that environment are operating within a structured framework. We're naturally wanting to progress that. If you look at any property transaction, your finance side are regulated, the legal side is regulated.
Everything else is regulated, yes.
But the one set of people that have the only complete oversight of an entire chain or a property transaction is the estate agency function. You know, they probably have more control over a chain than the other two players in there.
Well, they're the communicators within that transaction. So it seems to be taking some time, though, not through any fault of Property Mark, but it seems that the government, I guess they've had a few other things on their mind over the last 18 months, have kind of kicked the can down the road a little. That's frustrating because we've talked about licensing this industry since I first came into it, which was, dare I admit, 1984. Do we think that there's a real prospect in the next 2 years of licensing happening in the UK?
I think we're all optimistic that things will move in the right direction. And let's be honest, you know, government will have one priority one day, and then they can move into other priorities. Obviously, we're now levelling up quite a lot. That's the latest.
That's the phrase.
That's the phrase that we're going with. And there's great arguments behind a lot of that. That is there to balance things out, really. The progression, I think, for us as a profession, as an industry, I think is a natural. You know, there will eventually, I would hope, get to a stage where we get that resolved. And again, you know, when you look at people that detract and say, "Oh, we don't want to be licensed," or "We don't want to go through that,"
I think it's a minority of the industry.
It is a minority.
I think the majority of the industry understand that not only licensing is a good thing; it raises standards, but from an appealing to the public point of view. You really need to be behind licensing. I mean, does anyone in the audience think estate and letting agents should not be licensed, should not be held accountable from a regulation point of view? Not many, I suspect.
I think we'd all agree. I think what I was going to say is the only people that ever very often are concerned about it. It's more about, oh, am I at the age I want to take an examination? Do I want to do that? You know, what happens if I do it and I fail the examination? I've been doing the job 20 years. So there's a natural fear of that, benchmarks like retaking your driving test.
Yeah.
But actually, by and large, when you understand the levels of attainment in the current qualification system of level 3 and level 4, you know, they are the majority of the work they're doing on a day-to-day basis. You know, it's not as frightening as it appears. Really.
I think the detail will be obviously very important, as it always is, where, you know, once the principle of licensing estate and letting agents properly has been established, what then happens in terms of, well, what are the ramifications, what are the implications, what are the implications for an agent that falls foul of the new licensing regulations? You know, are you in favour, for instance, of you know, suspensions, people losing licenses? And I appreciate it depends what the transgression is, but do you think this needs to be licensing with proper teeth? Because my fear is that if it isn't, then there's no point doing it.
Yeah, and I think probably the lesson learned again still would have to, you know, if you look at the benchmark of how you do these things, probably the lesson learned from that would be what went through again on the FCA really. You know, there was a very hard focus to get people there, get people over the mark, and then what's happened is over a period of time it has gradually tightened up as areas have been done. To accept a complete wholesale change overnight and everybody to be able to fully comply with that is a very tall order. Yeah. I think you've got to get, again, it's like building a building, you've got to get the foundations on and then you continue to build on there. And as more and more people come through the professions, obviously they naturally fall into a natural framework. They know no different, really.
Yeah, indeed. You mentioned policy earlier. Obviously, policy is a big part of your organisation's remit. Obviously, there's going to be some changes. So Mark Hayward has decided to stand down at the end of the year. What happens then? Is that all then down to you, or what happens? Because look, he's a big figure to lose, right?
Mark, he's a very big figure, and you know, he has a lot of credibility in those arenas and has been there for an awful long time. He was due to retire before the pandemic, and actually he agreed to stay on.
Well, of course, he stood down.
He stood down and carried on.
Back up and stood down again. And look, as we said earlier, there's been all sorts of things happen within the organisation. But so let's not labour that too much. But yeah, what happens kind of post Mark Hayward?
So post Mark, we've expanded the team in readiness for that. And to be fair, that team has been integrated very well. We have specialists that cover the devolved nations, so that will be Wales and Scotland and Ireland, and then obviously we have the main belt of the UK. So we've got a team sat there now of 5 people that actually work within that environment all of the time. And to put that in perspective, most organisations will probably only have 1 person in policy, maybe 2. And again, we are not wanting to just report on policy. We're wanting to get engaged, we're wanting to lobby, we're wanting to proactively ensure that we actually make changes for the benefit of both the professionals in the industry and also the consumers that come out the end of it. You know, you know, last month alone, I think we responded to 7 consultations. And anybody who's seen a response to a consultation, it is not short. You know, but we're now in a position we can do that. We've got another 4 or 5 going through this month. And to put that in perspective, most organisations would normally, you know, respond to 1, maybe at most, you know, two consultations. So we can be there more often now. We have political weight out there, and you know, yes, Mark is at the stage where he's ready to take things a bit easier.
Would he stay around? As in a consultant, a shoulder to lean into sometimes?
I think it would be wrong to say that you wouldn't at some point need to rely on at least 30 years of history sat there doing that. But in fairness to Mark, he is the kind of guy that we could just ring up and say, look, we're working with this. Yeah. Can we have the background story from there to take it the next stage
forward? Will someone come in to specifically replace him, notwithstanding what you said about you expanding the team anyway?
Yeah, so we're bringing in a new head of policy, which that hunt is out there at the moment.
So no one's been identified yet?
We have the interviews taking place in the next 2 weeks. So we've had
interested parties should email you?
Absolutely. So we've had a raft of interest come in. It is a slightly different role. Mark's role was a very, very wide berth, and what we've tried to do is focus this role so it will be primarily deliverable purely on policy remit, really. Yep. So it's a very focused role to actually make sure there's a continuous focus.
And to ensure that you can continue to successfully lobby government. I mean, so it's not just the formation of policy, and we'll come on to stamp duty in a minute, which is what we really want to talk about, but being able to gain access, because undoubtedly Mark had access.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and I think the stamp duty pandemic was a prime example of that, really. If you look at business rates, for example, that was, estate agencies weren't initially involved in that process, and it was through Mark's intervention that actually happened, and that was nearly a £300 million swing.
And then we come back to the comms bit, because I don't think your organisation took enough advantage of those successes. I know some of them are behind the scenes, maybe for good reason, but the fact that you're an organisation that does set out to be a representation of the industry and its members, shouting about those successes are really important.
I think hindsight is always a wonderful gift, but equally I think sometimes you have two ways of dealing with things. Sometimes you have to be outwardly mobile, you have to be shouting about things, but equally sometimes you have to be a little bit more discreet to get the end result that benefits everybody, really. And so I think policy, as we all know, and politicians all work in different ways, and so do different government departments, and actually the skill is the outcome, not necessarily always the headline. And so I think it's fair to say there's an awful lot that we do, which benefits the property sector, which doesn't always get shouted about in the same way, really.
Yeah, well, as you said earlier, I hope that will change a bit in terms of the newfound kind of approach to communication. Right, should we talk about stamp duty?
We can have
so stamp duty is a hideous thing. So that there are people in the room here that have bought properties either to live in or indeed as investors. We've enjoyed the last 18 months of a stamp duty holiday, which I guess, has been sold to us as a kind of... a gift, a benefit, but at the end of the day, stamp duty, it's a tax, it's a levy, it's not something that anyone really wants to pay. Stamp duty, of course, was introduced in the 17th century, as something to fund a war on France. Now, I know we have a few issues with French fishermen here and there, but I don't think we're planning on going to war with France anymore. So it would seem... it does seem rather a stretch to continue with stamp duty, given that it's such an archaic tax. Typically, annually, stamp duty nets about £8 to £9 billion a year for the Exchequer. So it's a huge income for the government. But it's something that, of course, look, none of us want to pay. It has got progressively more expensive. So since 1997, Gordon Brown, when he came in as Chancellor in 97, very quickly increased it from a flat 1% across the board. Now you'll pay, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Nathan, the top rate is now 12% above £1.5 million, which is a lot of money. If it's a second home you're purchasing, there's another 3% that goes on top. And if you happen to be a foreign national, there's another 2% goes on top. So that's a 17% levy on expensive properties, which I think is absolutely abhorrent, frankly. But luckily, the man sitting next to me here has decided, as part of the Property Mark kind of suite of policies and lobbying, to hopefully do something about that. So we should talk about why, I guess, in the first instance, Property Mark want to see stamp duty reform.
So let's quickly start back to the pandemic. So I think we were fairly instrumental in actually getting the stamp duty lifted over that period, really. And let's be honest, stamp duty is a blunt weapon. Every time that is removed from the property sector, we see it spurge back. It's not the only factor involved in this. There was a pent-up demand. There were a lot of people over the pandemic that were trapped in properties which all of a sudden didn't have the additional room to work from home, didn't have a garden, and they had kids squalling around and they needed to do something with it, or a dog to go out. So people actually, by and large, have refocused what they want as living arrangements, and that's funded an awful lot of property transactions, moves, aspirational or otherwise. And we've also seen a lot of migration out from some of the main cities, and when you look at areas of outstanding natural beauty, they have seen considerable input from out-of-area buyers. Obviously, that in itself has then helped to raise those prices, then makes it slightly more difficult for people to buy there. So the migration that the pandemic has caused, was going to happen in any respect. What stamp duty has allowed, that stamp duty holiday has done, has actually allowed people to make that move rather than...
brought decisions forward.
It has indeed brought those decisions forward. So that side of things has been good because it's kept the economy going. It's also put a position, let's not remember, it wasn't too long ago that some people were still in negative equity. You know, we quickly forget that, and stamp duty and people in negative equity actually tie very well, because actually it does mean for people sometimes that need a bigger property, if they have no equity in their property and they have to find a deposit, or they've only got a limited amount of equity, they have to find a deposit and then they have to find stamp duty on top. That can actually mean that properties actually get withheld from the market. And there's a big debate that actually it's very often older properties that sit there, older people not wanting to move out their homes and wanting to pass them on. But
it's also those that are new to the market.
It's also those that are new to the market. And I think, you know, investment-wise, there's always a debate, should investors pay additional stamp duty? Overseas buyers, why was that brought in? Well, that was brought in primarily because obviously I think, you know, as we're looking out now over London soundscape, you know, we've got investors that put money into the UK from abroad, and it was a fairly easy solution for the government to capitalise on that, really, because at the end of the day, the millions that were coming in for those investments, you know, it hasn't stopped those happening, I think, is the fair thing. So it's still raised money.
But it's still, one of the reasons I think it's very unfair is that there's a real regional variation.
Correct.
So we're talking to some people earlier that have property portfolios elsewhere outside of London, where stamp duty is not so prohibitive because house prices are lower. So let's say take County Durham, for instance, where the average house price might be £120,000, not 250,000. Those buyers, on average, will pay no stamp duty at all. Correct. But for a first-time buyer buying a standard flat in London at £450,000, actually, maybe first-time buyers not such a good example, because first-time buyers have been let off in recent years. But let's say you're a second stepper, the stamp duty on that £450,000 at whatever it is, £5,000 to £6,000, for buying effectively the same property but for more money in a different region. I mean, how can that be fair? So, I guess that I don't know how much detail you can go into, Nathan, but I think it's clear why stamp duty needs to be reformed. It's archaic, it's a blunt instrument, as you say. But what do we do about it to make it better, but where governments somehow obviously still reap the benefit? Because they're certainly not going to forego that £8 to £9 billion every year.
No, I think we'd be naive if we thought they would. And let's be honest, the country needs to do that. And a lot of the...
particularly now.
Exactly. A lot of the transactions that happen are aspirational. So they're not all we need to do the move. And I think there's a defining difference between need to do it and want to do it. I think that should be taken into account. And I think the regional variations are quite important. And let's deal with it from two ways. So obviously we're sat in an investor show at the moment, so let's deal with it from an investment point of view. So if I'm buying a property in, say, the Midlands, for example, and, I don't know, I've then got my additional surcharge on stamp duty to do, and I'm buying a property to let it out, I have to factor that into my equations. That's fine. I'm buying it for an investment. Does that then affect how much money I then put into the property, refurbishing the property in order to hit my yields and returns and cover the cost of running that property? I think it's probably fair to say it certainly would do. The last property I bought, actually stamp duty very majorly came into that configuration, and it made a decision, did I put a new kitchen or a new bathroom in there? And so the tenant that went into that property, absolutely, so the tenant going into there, would they have had a different standard of accommodation? And I can only speak about my instance. Absolutely they would have done. They would have had a slightly different living experience. So I would have invested that money into the property, improved the accommodation that was there, for the benefit of the tenants.
So you're lobbying for all investment properties not to have stamp duty on them?
No, not at all. I think not at all. I think we have to understand that taxation, however it is derived, is needed for the fabric of the country. I think what we've got to say to ourselves is, you look at the average house price now, we're 270, 280,000, and you've got a stamp duty level kicking in at 125, unless you head out to Doncaster or Grimsby or County Durham or Newcastle. There's only so many areas where, you can actually start picking properties up. And it's not always the first-time buyers. Everyone goes, obviously, they've been catered for. It's very often the second-time buyers that don't have that much equity there, that need the additional accommodation. Is it fair from a regional point of view? We're levelling up at the moment, and I think the one thing about levelling up is it is trying to balance things across the UK.
Although the regions, of course, over the last 18 months have seen the highest house price increases compared to London and the South East.
Absolutely.
So what do you propose to make it fairer?
I think what we're trying to do is highlight the fact, as you pointed out, that the current system is an old, antiquated. It has been changed. It has been adapted, and it's been squeezed. But equally, it falls into council tax levies as well, and how they're all worked through. So there are several schools of thought out there. We're not here to support any particular one of those. What we're here to say is, as an organisational body, as a professional body, along with others that are coming to the frame, we think that this area of taxation really should be assessed and addressed in the wider scheme of things.
So at this stage, you're not lobbying for a specific detail around how it should be reformed.
Correct.
You're lobbying for the principle of it should
Absolutely. And there should be a full review. It would be wrong for us to go out and prescribe. It would be like me, giving somebody the medicine without letting the doctor review it as well. You can see somebody's not very well. Doesn't mean I'm qualified to necessarily give them the correct dosage. You need to bring other people into that environment just to check over and make sure that everything's right and sound checked. And you look at the different types of ideas out there. There are some people looking at a land tax where that is an annual payment or a monthly payment,
which is a version of the old mansion tax almost.
Absolutely. And that would incorporate their council tax. You've got others where people are looking at percentiles, where to deal with the regional differences, if you're in the top 10% in any particular region, you should pay X, and if you're, in the next section down, you should pay Y.
Although using property as the instrument is always tricky, because the case of the 80-year-old widow living in £1 million house with no income, to tax her property on the basis of the value of the property rather than income would be devastating.
Its own problems. And that's what I'm saying. It is a wider reaching review. But I think, as you referred to, and I said, it is a blunt weapon at the moment, which does get adapted, does get changed, it does influence the marketplace, and markets, by and large, need to have continual progression. Peaks and troughs don't help anybody.
Edges,
Absolutely right. And if you're not careful, you look at where we are now, the perfect storm. You've got hereditary low interest rates, you've had a stamp duty holiday, you've had
traction in the market.
In the market, we've shot up, and you've got to be careful that it doesn't take itself to an unsustainable level.
But my concern is that I don't have faith, and you might not want to comment on this, I don't have faith in government coming up with a plan. I don't have faith in government saying we've got this wonderful new process that incorporates either reform of stamp duty and or council tax together. Here's this wonderful solution. Don't we think it's for professionals and trade bodies, particularly as I'm often critical of government where I say the government don't listen to us as an industry. Don't we think that we should put this on a plate in front of government and say, so for instance, should stamp duty be paid by the seller, not the buyer? I mean, I'm not saying that's the solution,
no, exactly.
but shouldn't we put that to government? Because otherwise, I think that they're not, particularly this government, again, don't comment, but they're not great at being innovative and putting the right solutions in place without a push from the experts like us.
And I think, to suggest solutions again, I mean, you take, should the seller pay, that's great, but actually what you can then find is people then think, well, hang on a minute, I'll just hold on to it. If you look at private rental sector, for example, landlords who sell versus landlords that don't, there are quite a few landlords that will hold on to property, not necessarily invest to the levels that they need to do, because actually they just don't want to pay that great big tax bill, or they'll filter it through over several years. So I think to actually go out with solutions till you've actually looked at the whole, you've done a full diagnostic, would be wrong. I think professional bodies like ourselves and others are making government aware that we do feel that it needs to be looked at, and we will all engage in that review to go out and say, here's a solution.
Well, and maybe it's about consultation then, and a proper, genuinely meant consultation whereby the industry can feed back properly and constructively. And not just to say, do we think stamp duty needs to be reformed? Because guess what? Everybody is going to say yes, whether they're a member of the public or they're a member of the industry. But actually then to ask them what they believe the solution might be. But there's some clever people in property. And we should, I think, take advantage of that as the source of a solution, using property market as the conduit, to use your contacts to go to government and say, ultimately, look, we've done the job here. We all agree that it needs reform. Here are some ideas, and let's work on those ideas over the coming months to see if we can put something in place that's just fairer.
And I think equally, you do need to involve the other side. You need to involve the general public to a degree in there as well. We all accept we're going to pay a tax, but how is it, what is it, and how does it work about? It's quite an exciting melting pot. And equally, let's not forget there are some very, very intelligent people in government as well, whose attention may be focused on something else at this moment in time. And so, again, I think, you have to have everybody involved in order to at least get to a stage where all the viewpoints have been considered. We will take a property view. Doesn't necessarily mean we've taken into account every other aspect that falls
Or
off there,
economic
really.
implications, which is for government to be
Absolutely
concerned
right.
about.
Correct.
Obviously, you could only be concerned with the property implications.
Absolutely right. So again, I think it is wider reaching than people appreciate, and I think it is something which, there's people in the audience today that will be thinking, do I invest? There'll be people thinking, do I buy? You look at people in the PRS at the moment. The average. People in the 40s and 50s, there are more and more people falling into the long-term rental position. And that comes from a number of issues. Firstly, can they afford to buy? Do they want to buy? But actually to see that demographic increasing consistently year on year is quite interesting. And equally dealing with people's aspirational positions, people who want to buy, actually, how do I get that money together? How do I save that money? Is the bank of mum and dad actually going to be able to do it if mum and dad are in their 50s, actually rented accommodation?
Yeah.
Have they even got
with
the
no
deposit?
equity in a property? Yeah.
Correct. So the rental sector, in theory, is a massive player in that.
Yeah. Budget in 2 weeks. Do we expect to see anything or hear anything from Rishi Sunak in the way of stamp duty? I guess it's a bit too soon, is it?
I think it's absolutely right.
Yeah.
I think that's
He's not going to say
soon.
too much, I don't think.
And
Again,
I think
other fish to fry.
Exactly.
Unless, on the basis that he needs money to pay off whatever it is, £500 billion worth of additional national debt because of COVID. I mean, I'm not hearing any rumours to this extent at all, but will he continue to use stamp duty as even more of a heavy, blunt instrument to tax what is undoubtedly a buoyant property market, and then to use that money to start to, as one of many levers to pull to try and, feather his coffers further?
I think he's got several tools in his toolbox. And obviously stamp duty is the focus on here from where you are, but we mustn't forget that he's got capital gains he can play with. He's got entrepreneurs relief he can play with. He's got a number of other tools there, which actually, again, though a lot of those are based on asset sale.
Yeah.
And so you're taking out of a profit. It's all transactional, but it's not preloaded transactions. It's actually transactions that have happened. So in a very buoyant market, I would possibly suggest that he's going to look at some of those other tools.
Yeah, but the upshot is the 17th century tax on home ownership hopefully will be reformed one way or the other in the not too distant future. Let's hope so. Good. Okay, look, let's see if there's any questions. We had a good conversation at the beginning of this session, I think, with some people in the audience. Anybody got anything they want to ask, either on topic? We talked about estate agency and letting agency licensing. We talked about property mark, and obviously Nathan's good work in terms of advancing the organisation and stamp duty. Anything anybody else wants to talk about, either that relates to that or anything else for that matter?
What's the difference between you and property ombudsman?
Good question.
Good question.
Shall I just repeat the questions? So, gentlemen in the audience has said, what's the difference between property mark and the property ombudsman? Great question.
Then you've got the, is it NARLA?
Absolutely right. So,
NRLA, yeah.
So I'll explain. Brilliant question, and a good one. So you've got the National Association of Estate Agents, Association of Rental and Letting Agents, which is ARLA and NAA. They actually are part of Property Mark. So Property Mark is the umbrella organisation which looks after sales, lettings, auctions and commercial from a professional point of view. So it's a voluntary organisation where members actually sign up to be regulated by us to achieve certain standards and also professional qualifications as well. So we offer a full suite of qualifications to the property professionals and the industry as a whole.
Free to join on?
Sorry? Free. It isn't, no. There is an annual membership fee. Many organisations will actually pay for their employees to be members, so they get designatory letters if they are qualified under Property Mark banner, basically. So those post-nominals really are a great sign that people have reached the attained standard. And then we do regulate as well. So we regulate not only the individuals that are part of membership, but also we have companies that are membership as well. And we provide client money protection, CMP, so we have one of the biggest CMP schemes out there. So all of the big corporate agencies, by and large, will sign up to our CMP scheme, as well as a vast majority of small, medium-sized agencies. So that's effectively what we do. We have about 18,000 members at this moment in time. We cover about 12,000 offices across the UK, so it is quite good. So we are effectively a voluntary code. Then you do have like the Property Ombudsman, who we work extremely closely with, and we have a number of initiatives that we do it alongside them, and effectively they are one of two defined bodies that you need to subscribe to if you want to operate in the property industry. So if, for example, as a consumer you have an issue, you can go to the Property Ombudsman if they subscribe to the Property Ombudsman, but also you can come to us as well. So,
and the slight difference is the Ombudsman compensates the consumer.
Correct, absolutely right.
Yeah.
And from our point of view, we have a regulation team that will constantly be out there checking to make sure that agents are managing at the level that they should be doing, that they're signed up to the right things, they've got all the right certification in place, and we do find people if they fail to do that or
the NRLA don't do that. So the NRLA
No.
are not a regulator as such. They're an association, as the A in the NRLA indicates. Correct. So there's a difference. These guys are a bit, dare I say, a bit more formal, I guess, because of the regulation aspect.
Correct. And you have to be, so you can't just sign up. Correct. But you can't just sign up. So we do have you have minimum standards that people need to go to, minimum qualifications. Even if you came in as a base member, you'd have to have a minimum length of time within the industry to actually be able to become part of Property Mart. So it is designed when you see Property Mart regulated agents to know that these guys actually know what they're doing and they're on a path to continual progression as well. And they are in a position where, you know, if standards slip, there is somebody there to help guide them back onto the right path. Is that the word?
No, I think it is. And the ultimate advice has to be, if you're a property seller or you're a landlord and you're assessing which agent to use and they're not a member of Property Mark, NAA and or ALA or the NRLA, you really need to ask yourself the question why. Frankly. So, you know, being a member of one or all of those organisations, I think, is absolutely crucial. But as we've said, not all agents choose to be, and I think we need to ask ourselves the question why you wouldn't want to be overseen and scrutinised. Anybody else before we wrap up? Did you want to ask a question about the market, I think you were saying earlier? Yes, Kaya, do you mind? This question comes all the way from Finland.
Thank you. No, actually, I want to continue on the same topic. So, as a part-time landlady, I have all of my properties managed by the letting agencies. I am educated. I am trying to follow the market, trying to look after the properties the best I can, look after the tenants the best I can. But at the same time, I do want to make sure that the people I work with are the ones who know what they're doing and they can advise me as best as they can. What's the best way? Like, obviously, I can ask them to make sure that they are
members,
but like, what are the best ways for me to help them accountable for that and make sure that they are actually staying as educated and regulated from their side
that they
as
work to
possible.
the highest standards.
Exactly.
Absolutely right. And I think that's an excellent question. So if we just put the amount of legislative changes that happen, certainly, and from a rental point of view, you know, it literally is on a monthly basis. We are seeing changes in legislation, and we work very hard to make sure that we actually pass that information through. We make sure it's on workshops. We make sure it's in seminars. We have regional conferences. We have you know, a complete suite of information lines throughout the year. We have legal helplines as well, which even our members who, you know, will very often, or letting agent might have an issue with a technicality, they have a free legal helpline they can go to that will give them the guidance and support to make sure that they've got it. I think when you've got people that operate outside of that arena, how they actually can keep themselves abreast of legislation and best practice, it is an absolute minefield when you're doing a day-to-day job. You know, you need somebody to spoon feed that information to you in very simple format to make sure that you're doing the right thing. It's great to hear that you are what I would call a committed landlord, really. You want to make sure that your tenants are looked after. You want to make sure your property is at the right level, and you want to make sure that you're getting a good agent at good service. The cheapest agent isn't always the one to go for, really, because, again, what you have to bear in mind is there are people living in a property, and different people will have different types of requirements in order to make their enjoyment there. A good tenant in a property for a period of time will pay a good level of rent, and they'll probably stay there a longer period of time. We've seen the length of tenancy has expanded, partly because of COVID, but also I think because people do settle down. People are saying, look, we want to take a longer period of time in rental accommodation. So you have to almost think of tenants as a customer in a weird way. And when you go on holiday and you stay in a holiday chalet, or you rent an Airbnb, you want it to be at a certain standard. And that's exactly the same. Just because somebody's in a property for a long period of time doesn't mean they shouldn't have an adequate provision and an adequate service at the back of that, because they are paying for that service effectively.
Look for the ALA mark,
Correct.
basically. So.
Yeah.
Right, look, thank you very, very much indeed. And Nathan, thank you. I have one more question. Hope you're going to like this. Nathan Emerson, interim CEO, or Nathan Emerson, CEO?
So every job is interim.
We're going to get a politician's answer here, aren't we?
No, we're not. Listen, I agree to step into the role in order to drive through. That's very much been my background, as you know. I've worked within the property sector for a phenomenal long time, and worked as a consultant quite strongly in there. From a Property Mark point of view, I've stepped into the role in order to drive things through and get us where we need to get to. The job's certainly not finished at this moment in time, and
that's the clue, by the way.
and
so if you were offered the job, you take it.
If I was offered the job, I'd take it.
Well, if you were offered the full-time job, I know
I'm
you
doing
are
the
in the
job.
job, but
I'm
the
doing the
full-time
job.
job.
I'm doing the
I think
job.
we got our answer. I think we got our answer. Right, no, thank you very much
Is that all
indeed.
right?
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I think it's been very informative. Yeah, fantastic, and hopefully you're going to go enjoy the rest of the show. Brilliant. Thanks, Nathan.